I'm Joyce Hochsprung. Welcome to In the Garden. I'm a McLeod County Master Gardener, and I'd like to share a little bit about the Master Gardeners with you before we start. We're an outreach arm of Extension, and we'd love to have more people join us. There's training you can do online or at the Arboretum every year. If you're interested, just give Karen Johnson a call at the Extension office and she can fill you in on details. If cost is an issue for you, there are scholarships available, so don't let that stop you. If you like gardening and you like to share what you've learned about gardening, please consider joining us. And being a master gardener doesn't mean you know everything. It means that you know where to look for information. So if you ask us something and we don't know, yeah, it's because none of us know everything. All right, we're going to just start a quick tour of my gardens today. This is one of my beds. It's evolved a bit. There used to be a pond in here that when we moved in here 26 years ago, and it had a big crack in the middle and leaked. So one summer my son and I took sledgehammers and got rid of that and kind of redid things. This is what I call my island bed, obviously, because it's an island in the middle of the yard. And again, I've lost some shade here. I'm trying to get some new things going, but it's going to be a while. So some of these are getting a little more sun than they should, but since I do love hostas, they're staying and I'm just doing the watering that's necessary, or trying to anyway. I see one of our lilies just bloomed again this morning. That's a nice surprise. And this is one of my favorites, Angelica gigas. Later this summer, it will put up a big spike with basically maroon globes on it that the pollinators absolutely love. It's a biennial, so it will die after it blooms, but there will be new seedlings there next year that pop up. And there's already new seedlings coming up that will be next year's bloomers. So that's a fun one. I have a few more hostas in here. That kind of silver leaf plant down there is a lungwort. There's another one down here. I have a stilbe. A couple of my favorite hostas, Liberty and Sagae, right there. They get pretty big. The ferns weren't happy with that hot, dry wind we had. I've cut some of them back and they're starting to come back. The Japanese painted ferns down there weren't quite as unhappy as the ostrich ferns. A few coral bells in here, some masterwort just coming into bloom here. And this is my middle of the yard island bed. I had somebody bring in the stone for us because those are a little big for me to handle, and filled it up and just started planting. I have a variety of, these are one of my favorite early spring bloomers. They're nearly done for now. It's a species dianthus, and it's a blooming fool. I'll cut these off when they're mostly done, and it'll bloom again later this summer. Not quite as heavily, but it will. Here we have a tall white liatris that's almost ready to bloom, not quite there yet. And some feather reedgrass. This one happens to be El Dorado, a variegated form. And a lot of lilies, a hibiscus up in the front, and some daylilies that are just coming into bloom. And my garden helpers are coming in here too. Hi, Lucky. Okay, moving on into the yard, I have the beds that go around our garage and shop. This bed, we've just got a couple of bubblegum petunias, some Silver Falls dichondra, and this is a fall blooming feather reedgrass. It'll get pinkish tan plumes late August, early September, and it's kind of a fun one. Although it does reseed, so you have to keep an eye on it. We'll move down this way. Okay, this bed is mainly lilies, ground cover sedum along the front. And I'm working on getting some along the back as a ground cover instead of mulch in this bed. So we've got that and a few daylilies that, as you can see by the leaves, didn't like the intense dry heat we had earlier. So we've got a few crispy leaves on there, but they'll be fine. Some more lilies. This one's an oldie called Latvia. I love the speckles on it. And we'll keep moving down along the garage here. I always get questions about these. These are a biennial, and it's called Scarlet Gilia or Ipomopsis. They're biennial, and there's a story behind these. When I was still in garden club, an older lady in the club brought a couple stalks of this to a meeting in the fall and insisted people take them, and I was kind of like, oh yeah, don't know if I want them, but okay. So I took it home and was too lazy to plant it, so I simply stood out by my bed and whipped the stalk back and forth like this. And then next spring I had these coming up and went, what did I do? What are these? So I had to get out my books because that's been so long. Internet wasn't quite as easily accessible then. So, but I've had it ever since, and I just kind of let them seed around where they like. Another one of my beds, this one is sort of a part shade, part sun one. So over there we have phlox and tall verbena, couple lilies. That little purpley one back there is hoary vervain. Got a great example of Japanese painted fern in here. Maybe we can get a close-up in a little bit. But these are really gorgeous ones. Unfortunately, I lost the tags for those two, so I can't tell you which ones they are. But they're a great fern to put in, and they're well behaved. They don't run. The clump expands and they stay in place. So I like to put a little odd things in my gardens sometimes. So you can see a tricycle there. I think it belonged to my little brother at one time. Okay, as you can probably tell, I like lilies, and daylilies and hostas are probably my favorite flowers, so I have a lot of them. So I tend to be more of a plant collector than a garden designer, I guess. But I try to still make it look fairly decent. One of my favorite daylilies here, well, they're all my favorites, but Long Lesson Show Off is just starting to bloom. And I love this daylily. It's a good increaser. On a mature clump, and this one's getting a little overcrowded, so I need to divide it, but a mature clump can have 35 to 40 buds on one scape. So that's a lot of bloom power. And Silk Road is just about ready to pop open. You see the buds are starting to show a little color. This is Always Afternoon, a good little performer. Not the most exciting color for me, but it does well. And if you like yarrow but don't like the way it runs, this is Coronation Gold. And this variety, this is Filipendula instead of millefolium. This one does not run. It will stay in a clump. The clump will expand, but you're not going to have it popping up 3 feet away. So that's another one that I like to use. The phlox, I believe this is Junior Dance, is just starting to bloom. Veronicas, this is one of the shorter ones. I don't know what this one is. It was here when we moved in. Probably either Giles Van Hee or Red Fox. I'm not quite sure. Atlantis and Pink Flight lilies back there. And I don't know if the camera angle can see it, but there's a daylily back there that again didn't like the heat coming off the siding this spring when we had that really hot spell. So we may have to move that one. Oh, about 15 or 20 years ago, my husband thought we should build a gazebo, and I'm like, yeah, whatever. And then I thought, well, that's okay because I'll never sit in it, but I can put a flower bed around it. So that's what I did. And it was true, I rarely sit in it, but I do have a good flower bed around it. So that was a fun thing. The flax is almost done blooming. One of my favorite early spring bloomers. And again, I just let it reseed where it wants to and pull it where it doesn't work. So a fun little flower. Normally a few weeks ago, it would have been covered in blue flowers, but it's getting to its end. Lily, stunning Asiatic lily there. And yes, I usually do deadhead my lilies. I'm a little behind on some of that because of the heat has kind of slowed me down a little. I'm not a fan of the tropics. But in here I also have more lilies, daylilies, black-eyed Susans, sedums. The baptisia is finished. A couple of grasses in here, Carl Forster, which I think I'm going to replace with a switchgrass next spring. This is an LA lily, which means it's a cross between an Asiatic and Lilium longifolium, the Easter lilies. And I absolutely love these. You get the bigger flowers, and in the newer ones, they've got some great height on them. And as if you haven't noticed, I kind of like tall plants. Not sure why that is, I just do. Maybe it's because of the space I have to fill. But this is Cagliotto, an Echinacea Cleopatra. The flowers start out a bright lemony yellow and then they kind of gradually fade to this creamy color. Heliopsis Tuscan Sun. This is Little Lamb Hydrangea. There are two of them in here. And when I first planted them, I put them here because everybody said, oh, don't plant them because they flop. And I thought, great, they'll flow down the slope. And they did for the first 5 years, and then they toughened up and stood up straight. So I lost that effect, but I still like the blooms. Okay, here's a little bit more of, well, it was a shade garden. This willow is slated to come down over here because it's dying, and so I've lost a lot of shade trying to plant some new stuff. As soon as the tree guy gets here and gets these down and the stumps ground out, I'll be putting in some more trees, but I'm hoping he gets here before too much longer. So these are also getting more sun than they should, but a few more hydrangeas and Annabelle up there, and Pinky Winky there. This one is, I have to look, beckoning. Gets quite large, as you can see, a nice variegated one. The fern is Lady in Red, which seems to do quite well. And I see our cat is going to photobomb us again. And some Echinacea, gray-headed coneflowers, cutleaf coneflower sometimes called, have kind of seeded in here in the last couple of years since the shade has moved away. So I've left them thinking they provide a little bit of protection for the hostas for the time being. Again, it's kind of a combination of sunshade, more lilies up the hill here. Some are almost done. The goat's beard didn't put on quite as nice a show this year as it has some years, just because of the dry weather, I believe, but it wasn't bad. The Thalictrum, this really tall plant, airy one, is just coming into bloom. The blooms are just starting to open. That's kind of a fun plant if you've never used it. And here's some more masterwort in need of deadheading. And the masterwort, many of them, especially the newer varieties, will rebloom if you deadhead them. So, God willing and weather permitting, I'll get out here and get that done soon. This is Lily Fire Truck. I think it's pretty aptly named. Sometimes you wonder about the names they give. This is a red-stemmed Heliopsis. Somewhere down there is the name. I think it's Prairie Sunset. But some of the blooms will have a little bit of red to the center. This guy's a pretty prolific reseeder, so if you want to keep it true, you need to keep up with the deadheading. Otherwise, you'll get reversions that aren't always quite what you want. This is my daylily bed. Not that they're limited to this. Daylilies are just getting started. Lilies in here are mostly LA lilies. The melon-colored one is Royal Perfume. Interestingly enough, it does not really have a scent, so I'm not sure why they called it that. Ariadne is an Asiatic, that tall, very delicate-looking one, and I believe that's Razzle Dazzle. And the one that's kind of a lemony, limey white is Fantasy. The hosta is Aria marginata, and being at the bottom of the slope, it got hit hard when we had that late frost. But, so you see, not all my plants look perfect either. I could cut off the damaged leaves, but as long as they're feeding the plant, I let them be. Okay, down here at the bottom of the retaining wall, we have Ligularia, and I'm not even going to try to say the name. It's the one that starts with it's PRZW something, Przewalski or something like that. It's got a kind of unique leaf, and I had it in other places when we first moved here, and it was never really happy. Once I moved it down here where it gets a lot of water runoff, it stays quite happy. So that's where it gets to live. Most of the astilbe in here, I planted one, and it's kind of self-seeded through here. It's the only one I have that tends to reseed. It's alive and kicking, I think, is the variety. So this is my newest bed. We built the shed, it'll be 5 years late this summer. So most of the stuff in here is anywhere from 4 to years old to having just been planted this year. It's still a work in progress. But as you can see, I have pretty much filled it up with lilies, daylilies, no hostas on this part. Love this grass, Millennia Sky Racer. The grass itself only gets to about this tall, and then later this summer, fall, it'll send up these very airy spikes, bloom spikes. A new lily for me. Well, I put it in last year and it was not impressive, but this year I'm liking it. It's called Coral Jade. It just took a year to settle in, I guess. Some daylilies in there. Can't remember the yellow one. I know Sonic Duck is over there, and this one is, I think, Viva Pinnata. This big guy back here is Joe Pieweed. That does take up quite a bit of real estate, but later in the summer when it's blooming, sometimes you can barely see the blooms for the monarchs on it. They just love the blooms. So a Tradescantia or spiderwort. This one so far has been pretty well behaved, but I do deadhead so I don't get seedlings. When it's done blooming, I'll cut it back, and that'll leave room for the plants behind it to shine. Some people have asked me, what are these Dr. Seuss-like plants? They tell me they look like the truffula trees in one of his books. This is an annual poppy. And again, most of them I'll pull up when they're done blooming, and I'll just leave a few seed pods to reseed for next year. If I didn't pull up most of them or cut them off, I would have a carpet of the poppies. This is one of the newer Veronicas. This is Eveline, and I got a surprise one this year. This little pale pink one, and I thought, oh, seedling, maybe I should pull it. And then on a whim, I left it, and I'm kind of happy I did. It's kind of a pretty pale pink. This coneflower is Echinacea butterflies Julia, and this one and the one on the other side are seedlings from that. I kind of let them bloom just to see what they looked like, and I liked them, so they got to stay. So even though they have no name, they are still here. This is probably my favorite funky looking seedling. It stays quilled. The petals don't open up completely. That's also a seedling from Butterflies Julia. So must be some really fun genetics back there in the background. This is kind of an unusual lily because it's what's called an AOA, which means it's an Asiatic that was crossed with an Oriental that was then crossed back to another Asiatic. So it's a little hardier than Orientals are in our area. Does better, multiplies, which sometimes the Orientals don't do too well around here. They can be kind of short-lived. So that's kind of a fun way to go. One of my favorite absolute all-time lilies is this one. It's not blooming yet, but it's Scheherazade. Gorgeous lily, and needs dividing, but when it's got plenty of space, I've counted up to 35 or 40 blooms on one stem. So that really puts on a show when it gets going. The balloon flowers are just starting to open. Started with bought seed for these when I started them back years ago because couldn't afford the plants, so I bought seed and started them. It was supposed to be white, and they were supposed to only get 8 to 10 inches tall. Well, I do have white ones in here, but they definitely get more than 8 to 10 inches tall. So, and then we come into daylily purple nurple and night rider. This is another one of the LA lilies that I mentioned. It's a cross between an Asiatic and an Easter lily. The edge is a little bit washed off with the rain, but it has what's called a glitter edge. It actually looks like gold glitter on the edges. This is Gypsy Rose, and she will just bloom and bloom and bloom. We'll get a good month to 6 weeks of bloom out of this one. This bed, some people tell me it's a little too big. I disagree. I like big and I like to fill things up. So we're gonna just move along this way. You can kind of see the swamp milkweed that just kind of has its area where it gets to move around a little, as long as it doesn't come up in the middle of something else, and then I have to pull it out. But we let it, quite a bit of it go in there. We've got another, that kind of variegated leaf plant back there is another Joe Pye weed that so far, it's only its third year, but it is staying shorter and a little bit more compact. Some lilies here. This batch back here is almost done blooming. We have Chianti, the light pink, and Heartstrings, the one with the reddish edge. One of my favorite daisies is this one. This is Shasta Daisy Becky, and it is a blooming machine. As long as you deadhead, it just keeps going and going and going. The grass, I love ornamental grasses too. This one is Prairie Dropseed, just the species. I don't have one of the newer ones. The Maltese cross is almost finished here, but there again, if I deadhead, I'll keep getting little side shoots, or I can just cut it down to the ground and it'll rebloom later with a little bit bigger heads. And the orange one and purple is an I don't know. When I bought it, it was labeled as a pink lily, and when it bloomed, it was not. So, and even the person that sold it to me didn't identify it, so that one remains a mystery. Between the lilies there is a bush honeysuckle. I don't know if you can see it or not. There's quite a few pollinators on that. That's the native Deervilla, or bush honeysuckle. This is Kodiak Red, which means nothing but except that the stem is somewhat red, and the blooms, when the leaves come out in the spring, they have a reddish tinge to them. Some of this is kind of, well, back there on the fence, there is a bike behind there that's also holding that up. That's a clematis that blooms about fair time, and it is literally covered with small blooms. The big flowered clematis don't do well for me out here. We just get too much wind coming through and it breaks the vines. But I found that the smaller flowered ones usually do quite well. So that's what I've had to go with. I just have envy for you, those of you who have sheltered locations and can do the big flowered ones. Several peonies mentioned in there. This is kind of as far as the peonies go that I get enough sun for. And more daylilies. This variegated plant, the flowers aren't really showy, but they're small and blue. And I have to think of the name of this one, but it adds just a nice little textural thing. It is a Caryopteris. I think it's Snow Fairy. I'm not finding the tag right now. The Bowman's writ down here has a few blooms on it yet. That really took a beating in those hot, dry winds earlier. Got pretty crispy. Hardy geranium. Oh, and I should probably mention the Potentia. I see there's a couple of them. They aren't open today without the sun shining, but you can get a little idea of what they look like. This is Monarch's Velvet. It does spread around, and as I fill in areas in here and add more things, I'll just take out some of those. And this is Solomon Seal Bayako. It's a Japanese variety. It starts out with just real, very faint white markings, and it gets whiter as the season progresses. This one has not been a real fast increaser, but which is not necessarily a bad thing if you know Solomon seal, but it is kind of a fun one. And just, well, as long as I'm here, we're going to just snip off these Martagon lilies that are done blooming. And since I'm not a neat freak about having everything picked up, they just go back in there within a few days, they're gone. So this Virginia down here, or pig squeak, is one of my favorites. This one has the best fall color. I think, what was it? It'll come to me eventually. But the leaves turn the most brilliant shades of bronze and red and orange and green that it's just gorgeous in the fall. I would plant this one even if it didn't bloom. This was a new lily last year, Eros, another Asiatic. I love it. I love those curled back kind of Turk's cap type of lilies. And the delicacy that it looks like, but it's actually kind of pretty tough. Down here we have still another Solomon seal called Grace Barker, with a lot more white in there than what you normally see. And along here is a ground cover astilbe called Pumilla. It's Pumilla astilbe chinensis. And anytime you hear chinensis in the name, if that's part of the botanical name, that tells you that it's going to be a little more drought tolerant than most astilbes are. It'll usually go flat if it gets really dry, but it doesn't go crispy quite as quickly. So that's kind of a nice one. And you can see here it's getting quite a bit of sun and still looking fair. This won't bloom until August. And it's got short little lavender flowers. The white Veronica is, okay, that's fairly new. I don't know it yet. Charlotte. And this is another one it's nice because it's got the variegated leaf for a little interest. Some more heuchera, coral bells, daylilies, lilies. The grasses here, this one that's just coming up is big blue stem. And it'll get beautiful fall color. And the color is showing up at about the same time the helenium over there is blooming. So this is a beautiful, I love this lily. It's called eyeliner. And if you get a close-up of it, you'll see it's because it's got just a thin edge of brown on the stem along the petal. And I think if we have time, we'll just do one quick shot. I also passed the dill. I have a daylily seedling bed because I like to do pollen dabbing, as I call it, on daylilies. And I see we do have a couple of seedlings blooming today, so which is always a fun. I always say it's like Christmas every time a new daylily seedling is ready to bloom, because I don't know what it's going to be. So I think that just about wraps up our tour of my gardens. And I think maybe another time we'll do some iris dividing and show you how to do that. And maybe a tour of the beds at the fairgrounds that the garden club and the master gardeners maintain. See you next time in the garden.